Now, previously we had done a special session on California, on where to put a practice. Now we're going to do something which is the addendum for that, and it deals specifically with Los Angeles. The situation is Los Angeles is hello. This is Scott McDonald of DrDemographics.com. We've previously done a special briefing on the state of California on where to put a practice. This is the subset of that, a special addendum, if you will, for Los Angeles. The reason is Los Angeles is so unique, and many of the things we talked about for the state of California just don't apply. For those of you who are looking on where to put a practice in an area of something like 10 million people, well, I figured you'd probably want to have something a little extra that is focused upon this area. Now, just to let you know a little something about me as I am considering Los Angeles. I was born and raised in Los Angeles. Went to high school there, taken college classes there through my family, moved early on, and I know Los Angeles extremely well. You may also be interested to know I used to be the Assistant Director of Public Relations for Six Flags Magic Mountain. And in that capacity, I've covered all over the area trying to find audiences and to learn something about the people there. So we're going to hit the ground running with this. Just a few quick notes. You'll notice that we're not going to talk about the rest of California. If you have not ordered the California briefing, please do so. There is no extra charge for this particular briefing, but you have to order that one in order to get, well, all the good stuff that's in here. A few things to keep in mind, however. Los Angeles isn't growing the same way that the rest of the state is. It is growing, it's increasing in population, but let me explain to you how areas grow, just in case you may have forgotten. The thing is, there are two ways that an area will grow. Number one is the birth rate. If you have a lot of babies being born in the area, well, that increases the number of people that are there. But in California right now, the birth rate is not doing particularly well, and therefore you rely upon immigration. There are two kinds of immigration. One is domestic immigration, in other words, people coming from other parts of the United States, and international migration, people coming from other countries. Now, you ought to be aware that very few people are coming from outside the state of California. One of the reasons that they're not doing that is because of an extremely high and growing tax rate, and property values are very, very high. This makes the cost of living prohibitive. Therefore, large employers are not considering California, and especially not Southern California. That isn't necessarily a terrible thing, but it's a true thing that you just have to recognize. So, Los Angeles has been relying upon international immigration. That's one reason why, at this moment, the population is about 51% non-white. And about 45% of the population was born outside the United States. This is creating an area which is what they call balkanized. That means that some neighborhoods are going to be extremely ethnic in their character versus others, which will also be balkanized or very ethnic, but they're not the same. And interestingly enough, the locations where there are a lot of one particular group versus another may be very close to each other. An example that I'll give of this is Glendale. Glendale was a traditional white neighborhood, which eventually became Hispanic, which eventually became Middle Eastern, which has now become, well, essentially Armenian. It is not as though the area is being built and torn down. It's just that new people are moving in, and they're moving in clusters. This same pattern can be found throughout many parts of Southern California. As I'll mention in just a minute, Los Angeles happens to be one of the largest Saudi Arabian cities in the world outside of Saudi Arabia. It's not just Muslim, it is literally people from Saudi Arabia who've moved in, but they're not located everywhere. They tend to find themselves dwelling in clusters. So let me go ahead and see if I can magically go to this slideshow. I know how much everybody loves watching me squint at the screen, It makes me feel just a little bit like somebody's grandma as well, and I just will apologize for that. All right. Look, the delivery may not be smooth, but doggone it, this is about as good as people can find as far as the information is concerned. All right, almost there. Let's start off like this. Now, again, this is a dental demographic briefing specifically for Los Angeles. If you ever would like to have me come to your study club or your dental school or whatever, please let me know. I make regular visits to Southern California for that purpose. And I believe I'm going to be at UCLA in a relatively short period of time. So let me move on. A few facts. There are more than 10 million residents in Los Angeles. Many people are going, thanks, millennials. Well, a lot of the people who have moved into California, what the domestic immigration I talked about, are young people who are there to work. About 71% of Los Angeles is white, which amazes people. But the majority of Hispanics refer to themselves as white. In Mexico, for example, you don't want to be considered an Indian. You want to be considered white, which means you have European roots. Yes, it's all very confusing. But I'll talk about that in a minute. Race and ethnicity are different. You just have to understand that. Non-Hispanic whites are about 29% of the total population. Over 50% are self-identified Hispanic. Now, what does it take to be a Hispanic? It means you call yourself a Hispanic. Doesn't mean that you have to speak Spanish or speak primarily Spanish. There have been Hispanics living in Southern California for about 300 years. Roughly 35% of Los Angeles were born outside the United States. Now, these people are especially prone to live in language and cultural clusters. That's what we're going to be talking about today to some degree. Roughly 30% of Angelenos have a 4-year college degree or more. That is not particularly high, but there are sufficient people because of the universities that do have big education. The situation is they do not live together. The median household income is $56,196. It's necessary for that rate of income to be able to afford to live in many of the neighborhoods that are there. Now, about 16.7% of the population in Los Angeles is considered to be living in poverty. 43.6% speak Spanish. About 8% speak an Asian language. The world's largest population of Saudi Arabian expatriates, as I mentioned before, about 20,000, live in Los Angeles. 15,000 Louisiana Creole persons of Acadian and Cajun background from Louisiana and the U.S. Gulf also live in Southern California, especially in South Central Los Angeles, and people are surprised by that. In 1980 and 1990, according to the census, Bosnians established themselves as a fairly large number in Los Angeles before the breakup of the former Yugoslavian Bosnian Civil War in the 1990s. However, Yugoslav immigrants were present in Los Angeles and Southern California. They live in San Pedro and Los Angeles since the turn of the 20th century. Let's talk Salvadoranians for just a second. They are the second largest Hispanic population in Los Angeles, a city which holds the largest Salvadoranian population outside El Salvador and the Salvadoran diaspora living abroad and overseas. Just as a little thing, I used to live in El Salvador. Yes, I did. In Usulután, San Miguel, the capital, Ciudad Delgado. Anyway, I live there. I know the people there. And an interesting little statistic is there are more Salvadoranians living in Los Angeles than there are in El Salvador. Something you also ought to know. They do not get along well with Mexicans. Now, one would think, oh, come on, they're all Hispanics. You know what? That is not necessarily true. So if you are a Hispanic doctor hoping to identify a particular place to go, it is not just enough to say, oh, there's plenty of people who speak Spanish. Are there people who will speak but also have your culture? That's the question. Now, Guatemalans are a smaller subset of the population, but there's still plenty of Peruvians and Argentinians. And yes, they tend to look down upon everybody who's not from their home country. Armenians make an ethnic presence in Silver Lake and Elysian Park and Los Feliz in Hollywood. Now, here's why that's important. Armenians traditionally in Los Angeles and in California overall have money and they've been well established. Former Governor Duke Majian was Armenian. And they have established themselves in such a way that if you're appealing to that particular subset of the population, you'll do fine. If you're in other parts of the United States, and this goes mainly for outside of California, but for a lot of other parts there as well, you have to remember that you're looking for a subset of the population to serve for a dental practice. It is not sufficient to say, oh, look, there's no other dentists there. You have to understand who the people are. And I'll talk to you about the concept of churning and why that's important. Now let's talk about Los Angeles's future. The population growth, well, it's still growing, but the rate of growth in Los Angeles is much, much lower than it used to be. It's primarily because of a declining immigration. The Latino majority, well, it's up, but Asians are making huge increases. Now, it's just kind of worthwhile remembering. Just because a neighborhood is Latino now doesn't mean it won't be Asian tomorrow. And just because there's a large Korean population today doesn't mean that that Asian population will remain Korean. They tend to be displaced by other groups. Educational attainment disparity. Now, this is what percentage of people have bachelor's degrees in any of these groups. Now, you remember, in Los Angeles, we're looking for subsets. 11% of Latinos have a bachelor's degree. 39% of non-Hispanic whites do. 23% of blacks and 48% of Asians and Pacific Islanders do. Now, this presents a problem because even though we like to live in a colorblind society and believe everybody's just the same, the reality is, especially in terms of their lifestyle, income, and educational attainment, they're not. 18% of the children in Los Angeles under 10 between 2000 and 2013 basically disappeared. Now, what we're saying is Los Angeles is becoming a less family-friendly place than it's ever been. 20% of every 100 people of working age are seniors. And that ratio is projected to double by 2040. Now, what this means is when a population is not having small children, that the number of senior citizens tends to become more and more important. That means geriatric practices will become far more common and more important almost in every area you're considering. Now, Asians and blacks are about 22% of the general population. Asian immigration and higher birth rates are having an effect on increasing their numbers. The black population, even if nothing else happens, is going to decrease by percentage in Los Angeles. The black population in Los Angeles had tremendous political sway, but that has been eroding over the last 15 years. Some of you may recall Mayor Bradley, who was a black mayor in Los Angeles, had a tremendous following, but he has been displaced, and Gil Garcetti has taken his place as the largest political bigwig in LA area. And obviously he's Hispanic. The average household size in Los Angeles is 1.6 people. That is low. And it's low for Los Angeles and low for the country. The average in the US is 2.4. It just means a lot of people are living alone at a higher rate. The percentages of never married males, divorced males, widowed males, and widowed females are among the country's highest. Now, what this really means is there are more and more single people, particularly men, in Los Angeles. The Mexican population, by the way, is 23.1%. As you can note, it's just a subset of the population that is Hispanic. Koreans, by the way, at 3.6% are a very common ancestry. However, they obviously are not dominant, as you'll see in other parts of Southern California, in particular Los Angeles. Now, I know that this is all kind of hard to deal with and kind of frustrating, but look, if you want to practice in Los Angeles, you have to know your neighborhood. And the neighborhood is often established by who's living there, not just by socioeconomics, but by race, ethnicity, language, and culture. Now, I want to explain something about the city of Los Angeles that almost no one understands. You're going to be so smart if you listen to this. Listen, here's the thing. This is an outline of Los Angeles. Yeah, Los Angeles County, granted, but not the city, but it still is Los Angeles. If you want to know where there is growth in Los Angeles, where there is new construction, very little of it is going to be going on south of Simi Valley. If you look north to Castaic, which is part of the Santa Clarita Valley, and if you look at Lancaster and Palmdale and Quartz Hill, which are up in the high desert area, this is where the middle class affordable housing is going on. There is very little land to develop or that will be permitted to be developed in that southern region within the city. Now, some people have the idea that these little cities that make up Los Angeles are all contiguous, and they are not. So if you look at the city of Burbank, which is almost right in the middle of your screen, Burbank is a separate city, has its own city hall. Same thing's true of Pasadena. They're part of the county, but they are essentially not part of Los Angeles City. The confusion then lies in schools. A lot of places that you may consider, oh, that's Los Angeles, are not really Los Angeles at all and will not be in the Los Angeles City School District. However, there are many places that are grandfathered in. Let's keep going. I'm not trying to confuse you, but I am trying to give you an overview of how to understand this area. This is an actual map of the city of Los Angeles. You'll notice that there are parts that go down to, say, San Pedro that are kind of in a brown area. What that really means is these are not part of the incorporated Los Angeles. So if you're trying to find something that is going to make any kind of sense at all as far as regulations, you sort of have to take a look at this map and realize Northridge and the Pacific Palisades have something in common. But when it comes to Inglewood and, say, Garden Grove or El Segundo, they're not going to be regulated in the same way. Not trying to give you a heart attack, just trying to tell you what the reality is. Now, the neighborhoods that are identified here can be a little bit confusing as well. I'll talk about what downtown Los Angeles means because, frankly, it's not what most people think it means. Now, here's the most important part of this little lecture today. A lot of people will be driving along on a road and they'll see all kinds of houses being constructed in neighborhoods. And they'll go, ooh, that's where I want to put a dental practice. Those locations in Los Angeles may exist, but only in very, very small areas. What you're looking for is churning, not new construction. Churning means this: it's turnover of population. You see, as one group moves in, another group will tend to move out. And I'll give you an example of this. I grew up in the West San Fernando Valley. In fact, my parents started out in Van Nuys and moved off to the west as new developments were built. My father was a building developer. Eventually, we wound up in Woodland Hills. Now, at the time, Woodland Hills was made up primarily of people who moved from New York City. They were predominantly Jewish. And in that environment, they built up the area. Many people in the industry, the entertainment industry, were there. But eventually they were displaced by people who were of a different ethnic group, and they would also work in different industries. So the western part of the San Fernando Valley has actually gone through 3 or 4 major turnings since I grew up there. Yes, the buildings are the same, and yes, the homes are the same, but it is entirely a different location than it once was. What you're looking for whenever you're going to an area in Los Angeles is this: what is the displaced population currently like? Now, a demographer can actually say, oh, so you're moving into Tarzana, or you would like to move to Pacoima or any particular neighborhood, the population that traditionally has been there may or may not be there. Even parts of South Central Los Angeles, which have been traditionally Black and in other parts Hispanic, have become gentrified, in which younger people, often of different races and language groups, are now there. The challenge then is to figure out, as we churn, as we mix the population up, in this game of musical chairs, who's got the chair right now? Now, to provide some rationality, I talked to you about the Palmdale, Lancaster, and Santa Clarita valleys, which are further to the north of these sectors. I want you to understand something about this map, because it's as rational a way as I know to define the area and find areas of opportunity. So if you happen to have a pen or a pencil and a piece of paper, I'm now going to tell you things that are so complex you can't really write them down easily. Let's talk about the San Fernando sector. That is primarily in the San Fernando Valley. If you look at this area and say, all right, how does it become rational? You always look for the 134, which is also called the Ventura Freeway, also Highway 101, it's another name for it, and the 118 freeway on the north. They tend to divide the valley on an east and west axis. Most of the new growth, especially in new upscale apartments, are going to be on the north side of the 118 freeway. The homes that have most money in the San Fernando Valley are going to be single-family dwellings on the south side of that 101, 134 freeway, up in the foothills. Everything in that sandwich in the middle will tend not necessarily to be poor, but it will be poorer than those two extremes and will have less growth and less development. Those are in that middle, that sandwich in the section in the middle is where the retail opportunities are. Most of the practices for sale are going to be found, however, on the immediate north and south of the 118 and the 101 freeways. It's not as though the San Diego freeway, which is the 105, or the Hollywood freeway, which is the 170, or even 5, the Golden State Freeway, are unimportant. They definitely are, but one doesn't calculate how far from those points that a practice will go. People do travel primarily on the east and west axis because that's the natural commute path. They don't travel on the north and south to get off the freeway to go to offices. Those are more regional transportation arteries. Now, if you look at that area right where it says 134 and 2, we're talking about Glendale, for all intents and purposes, that area that seems to be constantly changing hands. Now, there is a lot of churning in that particular neighborhood. All of these neighborhoods are going to have some churning, it is true. But what I want you to understand is if you want to find a practice site for sale and you want to understand something about its socioeconomics, you have to take those things into account. Now, let's go down to the West Side Central sector. Those of you who know UCLA and also USC, that they're in that area. And here, the primary road to keep in mind is the 10 freeway. Now, the 10 is a feeder collector freeway. So other freeways will lead into the 10 and then take people into the downtown or into the surrounding neighborhoods. On the north and on the south side of the 10 are different segments of the population, but you have to understand it's as though it's the Great Wall of China, meaning nobody crosses the 10. It is a barrier that is almost absolute. Now, the 405 freeway is also known as the San Diego freeway. One travels from the north down to the south along the 405. It is one of the busiest roads, along with the Interstate 10, in the United States. It just doesn't get much more crowded than there. However, it also features some exceptionally wealthy homes because that's also Beverly Hills and Santa Monica and those communities. I just want to say something to you because a lot of people are going, well, but tell me where there's no competition. Los Angeles has got competition almost everywhere. So don't look for places where there isn't any. What you want to find is a population that you, doctor, can serve and grow your practice. Now, I say this because some people would say, I'd never move to Santa Monica or Beverly Hills. It's way too expensive. And it is true, there's a lot of competition and the cost of doing business is high. However, if you want to make a serious amount of money, those are the places to go because the population is very inclined to go to the doctor, especially the dentist, and they've got money and they're looking for people who can help them in their particular needs. But just keep this in mind. As you're looking at the population, you have to be ready for the expectation that there will be competition. Now, the South Bay sector has a little less in terms of population density for the most part, but the west side of the 405 freeway, the San Diego freeway, is very different from the east side of the 405 freeway. The money primarily is going to be on the coastal side or the western side of the 405 freeway. This will be true all the way down until you get to Ranchos Palos Verdes. These are the Palisades. It's a very upscale area, and very few people move in or out of the area. As one travels further south on this map in the South Bay sector, the churning goes down. It means that what seems to be happening in the South Bay sector is more and more older people hanging on to homes that are becoming increasingly expensive. Now, I want you to just take one quick note at the 110 freeway, which is between the South Bay sector and Gateway sector. The 110 freeway is also a line of demarcation and is very hard to get from one side of that to another. As one travels further south, the population becomes more stable and less likely to move. However, in the northern part of this is where a lot of churning is going on. Younger families, a lot of gentrification, and there is some new development, although it is not huge. Now, I also want you to understand that 405 freeway cuts a swath as it goes south and will eventually turn over to the east, or in other words, as you're traveling in that direction to the left, into the Gateway sector. Now, what we're noting in the Gateway sector is an increasing transition between Black and Hispanic families into Asian families. Now, this would go for San Pedro, which is about where that 47 on the very bottom of the map is found. And the 405 itself is serving as a commute path that takes people further south, as well as back up north on the 110 freeway, the 405, the 710. I know this sounds a little bit like an episode out of the Saturday Night Live where, you just take the 110 and then the 405 and the 118. Sorry. But that is something you have to understand about Southern California and specifically Los Angeles. It's how people think. Therefore, a practice is identified not by the city that it's in as much as the roads that one takes to get there. Now, I just want to go back for a moment and talk a little bit about the Gateway sector on the north side. There is significant poverty in that area north of the 105 freeway. If you look where the 710 is found on this map in the Gateway sector, it is not a place that most people would say, yeah, that's where I want to go, unless they're serving the poor. Now, please understand, there are practice models where serving the poor makes a huge amount of sense. This happens to be one. But it's also a remarkably high crime-ridden area. Remarkably so. Now, I have not talked about the Golden State Freeway, or also known as the 5, very much. And that is because it's more of a regional transportation artery. People get on the 5 and travel a long distance. They don't get off and on the 5 very much as it heads down toward Orange County, which is that area which is on the southeastern side of the Gateway sector. Now, let's talk for a second about the San Gabriel sector. I'm going to talk about topography in a minute because really Los Angeles is built along the interstate freeways, but also the valleys. The Los Angeles basin is really a big valley, a flat bottom valley, granted, but the sector on the San Fernando and San Gabriel Valley are distinct in that they have elevations which separate them from other places. And in the minds of residents, that's all important. Now, just as the San Fernando sector has the 101 freeway, also the 134, which is the Ventura Freeway, and the 118 on the north, the San Gabriel sector has 2 or 3 east-west transportation arteries that are all important. The 210 freeway, which is also the foothill, the 10, and Highway 60. Now, these have crossing streets, it is true, but each strata is different in terms of income. On the north side of the 210 freeway is where the money is. So if you have the opportunity to purchase a practice, that area north of the 210 freeway is definitely where you ought to go. A startup is more likely along the 10 freeway as it runs east and west, and that is also true for the most part in the 60. However, you have to be of the right ethnic persuasion to grab those people. Now, as you look at these freeways, you have to understand that is what the definition, or that is what's defining the areas that you're going to. Where do I think you ought to go? Well, the problem here is this. An average practice size is geographically between 3 and 5 zip codes. There are hundreds of zip codes depicted in this, and those zip codes will tend to follow the interstates. Therefore, we can identify locations based upon several factors as you're looking at this map. One is the race, ethnicity, or culture that you want to reach. We can look at a limited degree about where growth is, but you see, growth is actually a phenomenon that is far more localized. You can't say, oh yeah, the San Fernando Valley is growing, San Gabriel Valley is not. No, that's not how it works. Yes, there is some growth on the backside of Burbank, up in Montrose. Sure there is. But it's not so great that you could say, blanket, oh, it's where to go. So as I'm talking about these areas, you just have to recognize each area of these sectors is divided up into smaller sectors, often by topographical, means mountain ranges, and by freeways. And those are very important for you to know. I think it may be more helpful for you if we actually had a telephone consultation. I could guide you which direction you ought to head if Southern California is what you're after. Now, I mentioned to you the importance of the freeways. It is true that if you look at some streets like Vermont, they will tend to go through the freeways or really under them in this case. Yes, we can look at all kinds of places to potentially travel, but just recognize in this downtown area, getting from one point to another is very, very hard. So, for example, I mentioned before the 10 freeway is hard to get from one side to the other. Therefore, you are serving either the north or the south part of the 10. It will be even more difficult to move in this downtown area along the 5 from one side to the other because the cross streets are much more crowded and much more confusing. By the way, where these the 10 and the 5 and the 101 all come together is called the 4-level interchange. And if you ever want to have a nervous breakdown while you're driving, that's a really good place to try having it. Now, I believe that there is a resurgence of growth, particularly for young urban professionals, in this little square, which is formed by the 10, the 110, the 101, and the 5. And they're living in very small neighborhoods, a little like a San Francisco. If you look at the south side of the 10, that's where the Olympic is. It's where a lot of entertainment is going on. There's a lot to do here, a little like a New York thing, but there isn't the transportation artery thing like they do in a subway. There are not single dominant streets like a Broadway or a Fifth Avenue. Here, you are tending to see the streets being dividers rather than unifiers of the population. Just keep that map in mind. Now, real quickly, if you were to go off on the 710 freeway, which runs north and south, it's on the right-hand side of your screen, and you go into Monterey Park. No, it's not a thing that they're saying you have to be Korean or Asian to live in that neighborhood, but yeah, kind of there is, yeah. And it's not that people are going to force you out. It's just if you want to be successful, you have to make sure that the people you are after match who you are. So let me just keep going on. I mentioned the topography of the Los Angeles Basin. As you will note here, the mountain ranges really do define things. So the Santa Clarita Valley, which is just a lovely place to go and relatively upscale, is off to the north, but very separate from the San Fernando Valley and San Gabriel Valleys, which define it as you go further south. If you hope to have someday a nice place that is going to be right near the beach, forget it. There, I've said it. Let's move on. Now, looking at this larger view, I just want to say that it's the north side of the 10, the north side of the 118 freeway, the western side of the 405 freeway, and even all along the coast along the 405 that is going to have the most potential growth. I would just point out one other quick thing. This also shows Orange County, which is a little bit of a cheat. Orange County is having more growth, more single-family dwellings than Los Angeles is. That is why, generally speaking, when people say, where should I go? I don't mention Los Angeles as the first option. Now, I've given you kind of a highlight of what Southern California looks like, what to evaluate, places to consider. That's what my purpose is. When it really comes right down to it, when you want to do a report, my strong suggestion is talk to me on the phone first so that we can define the geographic area that's going to work well for you. I know Southern California very well. My people are also quite trained in it, but it is not a place to go for the faint of heart. And I'll just kind of wrap up on this note. It is not because aren't good people. There's some wonderful people here. The problem is the growth has changed so that it's different from the traditional California mechanism for growth, which was to find empty land and develop it. So much exists that now we're in the point of turning over. That's what we mean by churning. I wish you the best of luck, and if we can help you, please come to drdemographics.com. I'm Scott McDonald, and thanks so much for listening.